Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the M. Weena Foundation of New Jersey, the Thomas and Teresa Malaki Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the William T. Grant Foundation, and from the corporate community, Rhoda Finn. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and this is the second of two programs with radical media scholar Robert W. McChesney, Research Associate Professor at the University of Illinois. Our focus, of course, is on my guest's new book titled Rich Media, Poor Democracy, an intellectual equation I would like to elaborate upon still further today, perhaps by first parsing my guest's subtitle, Communication Politics in Dubious Times. That's the question I want to ask you. What do you mean by that?
Well, communication politics refers to sort of debates over how media are owned and operated and subsidized and run. But I think the really interesting part is the last part, dubious times. What do I mean by dubious times? And originally I was going to have the subtitle be like turbulent times, but that's sort of a bogus, that's a throwaway title, doesn't mean anything. Dubious was really meant to capture the fact that we really live in a increasingly depoliticized climate. I mean, I think it's been a pattern, a long-time pattern in American history, but it's accelerated recently. And it's a system in which people increasingly are divorced from political decisions, decision-making. We're a democracy, as Robert Entman put it, without citizens. I mean, the decision-making is so stripped away from the general population. And the media is a crucial part of that, which is, of course, an argument in the book. It sustains that. It's not the only cause, but it sustains that. But the dubious times are also is that we have a number of myths and half-truths that protect entrenched power from democratic scrutiny, including the media and the corporate media. The idea that they give the people what they want, what we talked about in the first show, unambiguously, so they aren't to be blamed. The idea that the First Amendment was passed to protect the property investments of the investors in these 9 or 10 companies from any sort of public scrutiny or obligation. The idea that these new technologies like the internet will set us free so we don't need to worry about corporate media or commercialism. Now, these lies or half-truths or myths combined sort of make it very difficult for us to see through what's going on to really act as citizens on the important matters before us.
But you say depoliticalization.
Yeah, depoliticization.
Politicalization, thank you. What do you mean by that?
That people,
we don't vote?
Well, that's a manifestation of it, by no means the only one. I mean, you can look at our voter turnout, and it is extremely low by most any other country's standards. I think in the 1998 congressional races, the percentage of the eligible adults in the United States who voted was 35 or 36%. I might be off, but not by more than a point or two. And that's well below what it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and even 4 years ago. I mean, it's really sort of a stunning descent in that vote. Even 4 years ago, during the so-called Republican Revolution in '94, I think it was 38 or 39%, and that's a pretty huge drop for a 4-year period. So that's one measure of it, but that's not the only one. I think that a lot of sociologists who look at political culture, who actually just go out and talk to people or measure this, I mean, the basic thing is most Americans don't really care about politics in any sort of traditional sense. It's not talked a lot. There's not a high degree of knowledge. Now, I don't mean that in the sense that they wouldn't care or don't care in certain ways, but in sort of traditional manifestations, if you go out and try to ask someone about a bill in Congress or something, the interest is fairly low, and I think it's rational. I think it's an extremely rational response to how power operates in the society. Most of the important decisions in our society are made either by the corporate sector with no public involvement wanted or solicited, or they're made behind closed doors in Washington, the province of special interest. And in that context, it'd be irrational if you weren't one of those players, either corporate or special interest, to get too interested in politics, because it'd be very frustrating to know what's going on and not be able to do anything about it.
But then, you know, that's why I ask you the question as to how realistic are you when you put before us a picture of an aroused democratic society striking down if they have the opportunity to. This kind of I'm all right, Jack, the devil take the hindmost society that keeps them out. You describe people who are less and less involved, who could go to the polls but don't. What makes you think that they are going to embrace what I'll call the radical ideas you set forth?
Obviously, I'm in no position to say they will, but I'd like to have an opportunity to have that debate take place, and I'll take my chances. Right now, there's not much of a debate going on over anything. I mean, people don't vote. Look at the range of debate in the presidential race coming up in 2000. I mean, you have the left wing is held up by Bill Bradley, who last week the New York Times ran a front page story saying he receives massive amounts of corporate money, and he's the left winger in the race. The range is from A to B instead of A to C. So it's understandable why people wouldn't vote. What I want to do is expand the range of debate from A to Z, and then let's see what happens. Let's put everything on the table. Let's try to break the straitjacket of a political culture which basically is hostile to genuine politics and make political life resonate again with some meaning, and that's part of the function. Now, this is a process. It's not like you push a button and everything gets better. It might never get to the end I'd like or that you would like. It's a 50, 100, 1,000-year process, who knows, but we can get better. And things work. If you open up the media system a little bit, ideas get out, then other things can change, and they go back and forth. Then you have a broader culture for ideas, then it might be in the commercial interests of current companies to do stuff they wouldn't do now because there's more of a market for it.
Well, you say that one of the myths that stands in the way of the possibility of that choice is the myth of the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. Elaborate on that.
Well, this is a chapter in the book, and it's one that I'm especially proud of because the First Amendment is held up currently in the United States as sort of trade legislation to protect investments in huge companies that have interest in media and advertising, so the government can't interfere with them. And I think it's a recent development. It's in the last 50 years the process has developed, and really in the last 20 or 30 years. And what it reflects basically is the complete dominance of our society by corporations and commercial values and the elimination of non-commercial values, so that it sort of naturally assumed this very pro-commercial stance. And what happened, ironically, is you've had the expansion of the First Amendment, meaning the expansion of the First Amendment to cover advertising, which was the first time it came before the Supreme Court in 1942, was shot down 9-0. The justice said this has nothing to do with the First Amendment protecting advertising. But now, under a series of recent decisions, it's increasingly gotten more and more protection. And when you expand the First Amendment to advertising, what you're really doing is you're shrinking the range of political debate, because you're taking advertising off limits. You're saying the public can no longer regulate it. It's protected by the First Amendment. So the corporate expansion of the First Amendment is really the legal shrinking of the range of legitimate political debate. When you expand the First Amendment so that commercial broadcasters get to do whatever they want on the air, and they get basically privatize the airwaves, they get them, you're shrinking the range of what the public can do to address broadcasting. I mean, that's why the stakes are very high on this issue, what's happening to the First Amendment is getting so much attention from the corporate community, and why it's crucial that we resist this sort of knee-jerk Philip Morris interpretation that the First Amendment's sole function is to protect private investors doing what they want with these companies, regardless of the consequences.
Yes, but the Aesopian language, nobody's saying it's its sole purpose. I think.
No, yeah, actually, I'd quite disagree. If you look at the language of Floyd Abrams, the language of the ACLU on these issues, Nat Hentoff, which I quote in the book. I mean, it is. They use extremely colorful language. Nat Hentoff says, and I quote him in the introduction to the book from an article written in January of 1999, that those who want to regulate advertising and commercial broadcasting, people like myself, are brothers and sisters under the skin with book burners and Klansmen.
Yes, but what you're saying, and I don't know why you have to go further than what it is you're saying now. Yes, Nat says that, and it's true that the ACLU has accepted the notion that we're not protecting ideas, we're protecting dollars, because the things are equated.
In a society with no ideas, all that's left is dollars.
Okay. But that isn't all that they're saying. That isn't the only purpose of the First Amendment. The trouble is they've poisoned the interpretation of the First Amendment, the proper. As a historian, I think I know that the founders, as you know, would be turning over in their graves with this notion. How have we come to accept this?
Well, fortunately, at the legal level, it hasn't been accepted yet. I mean, it's not a fait accompli at the Supreme Court level. There are a lot of cases that will be working their way through the courts. Advertising still is not fully protected by the First Amendment. Food labeling still is not fully protected by the First Amendment, meaning they can put whatever you want in the label and you can even lie and basically get away with it. Commercial broadcasting, still the public has rights. We do own the airways. Those haven't been taken away from us yet, but there are cases coming through. They're pushing the boundaries ever more in that direction.
What's your bet about those cases?
How will they turn out?
Yeah.
I really don't know. A lot will depend who's in the court. That's how these things work. But two things, the individuals in the court and also the political climate of the times has a lot to do with how these cases ultimately get turned out. I mean, we live in times that have been decisively pro-corporate, pro-commercial in the politics of this country for a couple of decades. That's been the turn. And the court has internalized those values increasingly. So the alternative, a non-commercial world, seems increasingly foreign, increasingly quaint. So even envisioning the First Amendment as having something that wouldn't be commercially enveloped is much harder and harder as every decade goes by. I think the solution, though, as I argue in the chapter, is what we need to just make a real commitment to increasing non-commercial voices like we talked about in the last program, aggressively trying to change the logic in the media system. That would go a long way toward addressing these problems and use what First Amendment rights we currently do have, which fortunately still are around.
You said before that one of the major issues here has been the secrecy that has enveloped the distribution of the spoils in the media, essentially. How to prevent that?
Well, that's tough. In 1996, for example, the U.S. Congress passed and President Clinton signed what's called the Telecommunications Act, which was a law. The law it replaced had been in place for 62 years. And it also replaced the consent decree that broke up AT&T in the early 1980s. So it was a decisive piece of legislation, one of the handful of the most important pieces of legislation probably of this generation. It, in all likelihood, will be the last formal statement Congress on our behalf has made on what it regards as the public interest and the important values for radio, television, the internet, telephones, the entirety of digital and electronic communication for generations. So it's a crucial piece of legislation. In that piece of legislation, it was a law that after 5 years of intensive lobbying, the law was basically a war between these massive lobbyists, the phone companies, the broadcasters, the cable companies. It was a hall of fame of superstar lobbyists paying a fortune, wrangling to see who could get the biggest cut of the pie. The one thing that wasn't debated, though, was who should own the pie. They knew they should own it. They were just going to debate who got the biggest slice. And accordingly, there was almost no press coverage of this whatsoever. If you were to read a daily newspaper, watch evening news, read Time or Newsweek.
Let me stop you.
Yeah.
You say accordingly.
Yeah.
You mean that? You mean that there was a kind of internal media censorship?
Yeah, didn't take any explicit censorship, but these are precisely the sorts of issues. When there's an agreement in the corporate community and there's no vocal alternative voice saying otherwise, then it will just be taken for granted. It will not be questioned by journalists. Journalists wouldn't go to their editor and say, I want to write a story on why all these corporations think they should run the media sector. The editors say, why are you injecting your opinion there? You can only do that if two of them are going to each other. I want to say who should have a better deal, the phone companies or the long-distance companies. Then that's a legitimate story. So just when they're all in unison on point, it's very difficult for any journalist to try to make that an issue without seeming like they're weighing their own politics in on it. And that's one of the biases, the conservative biases of professional journalism that powerful sources have taken advantage of since the birth of the public relations industry in the beginning of this century. But what happened was there was no press coverage of this. If you were a normal citizen who might be interested, you would have no way of knowing about it. It was covered one place extensively, though, very extensively, in the business press and the trade press, where it's covered as an issue of importance to investors. And that's what it was all about, investors, managers, who could make the most money. The fact that this was just going to be handed over to the corporate sector without any strings attached was a given to all of them. It's just who's going to get the best cut. Now, the importance of this simply is that this was a massive gift. I mean, there are two areas worth talking about because they affect us directly. Included in that bill, snuck into it, was a clause with no congressional debate, no legislative hearings at the committee level, requiring the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to give new spectrum to all the existing broadcasters who do digital TV. Basically saying, you guys have done such a great job for the last 60 years with commercial TV, without any hearings, any debate, any discussion, we're giving you spectrum so you can run the next 60 years. And you'll have the inside track on the internet as it develops into commercial medium.
But you know,
that's criminal.
You say
that's
this
criminal.
As though there had been no opposition. In your book, you point out that Bob Dole had initially said, we're not going to give them that.
Well, that's right. What happened was after this got snuck through in 1996, Bob Dole, then the Senate Minority Leader, was outraged by this. And there's a lot of differences in interpretations why Bob Dole got upset about this. We don't have to go into those. But he backed down. Basically, Newt Gingrich and some corporate leaders pulled him aside and said, we got to get this bill through, Bob. And he said, okay, I'll let it go through. He backed down. And he got one deal. He said, before you give away these digital licenses in the fall, I want the Senate to have full hearings, the public have full hearings on this issue, so we can actually weigh in on what we want the obligations to be if we're going to give this $100 billion gift.
Didn't happen.
Well, what happened was he resigned to run full-time for president. His replacement, Trent Lott, coincidentally, former college classmate of the president of the NAB, the National Association of Broadcasters, and I think his first act as Senate Majority Leader wrote a letter to the FCC and said, we don't want those hearings. We don't want those hearings. Give those digital licenses right away to the commercial broadcasters. We want them to get it without any hearings. And in that letter, he signed away $100 billion of public property and signed away the public right to have any control in setting the terms of that gift. It was an act of corruption that's almost unparalleled in our history.
You know, I realize in talking together now, the first program, this one, having read the book, we talked about the fact that we're both friends of Herb Schiller. I remember when Herb was on this program and talking about America's new imperialism, its communications imperialism, that you both think in terms of a purposefulness that the media, about the reporters who should have been doing something and the editors who should have been printing this, that they didn't because they weren't allowed to in a very real sense. Don't you think they didn't because they didn't understand it, because this is too complicated an issue? That they never explained it because they didn't understand it themselves?
Well, I think perhaps it was presented in very technical language. I mean, even at the time, if you were following in the trade press, you could see any self-respecting political reporter would see the politics in this one. And Bob Dole sniffed it out. I mean, he had a lot of other things in his mind besides digital TV, I mean, including what we later learned with Viagra. So he had a lot of things to worry about, right? And he managed to figure this one out pretty quickly, that it was a gift of $100 billion of public property. If he could figure it out, I think any self-respecting political reporter could sniff that one out. In fact, a lot did. William Safire wrote columns about it. You know, ironically, people on the political right picked up on this. John McCain at that time, before he wanted to run for president, now is sort of swallowing up money from corporate media PACs, because that's how you have to do it if you want to be president in this country. But no, so I think that's a cop-out for any journalist to say that. The story was wild. It was right there.
You know, given what you say, again, I don't want to, but I find this, I have this feeling there's a contradiction there, that on the one hand you're saying, we the people, we can prevail over this conspiracy. On the other hand, you're describing a picture that makes it very unlikely that we the people will prevail.
Well, you know, I'm optimistic for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you see the extent that the companies in this case, or in some of the other clauses in the Telecom Act, like the one that really allowed radio to be totally converted in the last 3 years to the province of 2 or 3 companies, completely outrageous implications for the quality of listeners in this country. When you see how much trouble these companies go to keep this stuff quiet, to make sure, not even get legislative hearings, not to mention press coverage, I mean, how assiduously they work to make these things behind closed doors. There's a reason for that, because when people hear about this, they have the same response Bob Dole had. And you know, when I'm out and I get away from college campuses and I get outside the Beltway and I get outside of Manhattan, where I live, you go to Kiwanis clubs, church groups, labor unions, you talk about just what we've talked about. People don't go, oh, well, you can't change anything. Some do, but most of them say, that's outrageous. I think the polling data that's been done recently shows that too. When people hear these issues, they have a chance to sink their teeth into them. They say, this is outrageous. And rather than throw their hands up and say, there's nothing we do about it, they say, we've got to do something about it. This is far too important just to pretend it doesn't exist.
Let's go back for a moment to this question of the First Amendment. You think that this is a myth, that you entitle your chapter, The New Theology of the First Amendment, Class Privilege over Democracy. Theologies are very hard to break down, and I wonder what gives you the sense.
Well, I don't know if I'll break it down, but I think you have to call it what it is, which is it's a belief not based on empirical evidence. In fact, you know, the defense of the First Amendment, for example, one of the defenses, and a related issue I talk about there because it's closely related, is the ability to give as much money as you want to political campaigns without any restriction, because they're closely related. Media reform and campaign finance, since the biggest opponents of campaign finance reform are the media companies, because they make all the money off of it, the broadcasters. But, you know, it's empirically, it's impossible to argue with the notion that having a system where anyone can give as much money they want to candidates is anti-democratic. I mean, listen to this, 80% of the individual campaign contributions in the United States, 80% come from the wealthiest 1/4 of 1% of Americans. I mean, consider the implications of that statement. all you need to know about how anti-democratic our electoral system is and why people don't vote and how lame it is and why the range of debate is from GE to GM, all you need to know is told by that one statement. So you can't defend empirically that unlimited campaign contributions is good for democracy. So it's defended theologically. It's defended as a matter of principle, not as a matter of empirical truth. And that's what it is. It's a theology. It's just like, well, any effort to inhibit the wealthiest person from buying an election will inhibit the ability of a poor person to buy an election. And so since everyone should have the right to buy an election, that we just have to basically let that go.
Isn't it wonderful that you and I can contribute as much money as possible to a candidate, and so can the richest people in
Bill
America?
Gates and Steve Forbes. Yeah, but I mean, it's just an absurdity. But it requires theology at that point. It's a leap of faith.
In your book, and you mentioned it before, you mentioned the hated phrase, public relations. And in your book, you referred to Edward L. Bernays and his first efforts. You feel very strongly about the negative role that PR has played in our lives.
It plays a very mandatory role in our society. I mean, it emerges at a crucial time in our history. I mean, not distinguished entirely from advertising, but the beginning of the 20th century, this industry comes about. And there are two key phenomena that take place at the time. First of all, it's the rise of professional journalism. Professional journalism was something that came about basically by big newspaper publishers had a problem. By the early part of this century, there were mostly 1 and 2 newspaper towns where previously, two generations earlier, there had been competitive markets with 10, 15, 20 newspapers. And they were highly partisan newspapers, even though they were commercial well throughout the 19th century. But the early 20th century, when you only got 1 newspaper in town, if it's highly partisan, that's a whole different thing than if you got 10 to pick from with different viewpoints. And it was very bad for business. Advertisers didn't like it because you were turning off a lot of the audience if you have strong politics. And also, it wasn't the product's not very credible if the readers think, well, all the stories are slanted. So professional journalism, the idea of neutral journalism came along as an effort to sort of sanitize the news product for these investors and basically to say, here's a neutral product that's run by editors and reporters, not by owners and advertisers. You can trust it. You can also trust the ads we run. And PR came along because one of the core tenets of professional journalism is the use of official sources to justify covering a story. If an official source says it, it's a story. It also is a way official sources then subsidize the news process by providing all this material for journalists. And it makes the job a lot easier and a lot less controversial, which is what publishers want to avoid, the controversy of defending selecting stories. Well, the PR industry comes along because it says, hey, there's something we can work with. We'll provide all these official sources. We'll provide sophisticated material to influence the news, taking advantage of these new practices. So that's one of the key things it does. And then in a more broad sense, what PR does, there's an Australian theorist of public relations, Alex Carey. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
But I read his quotes.
Yeah, I mean, Carey had an argument, which is the 3 great developments of the 20th century are the rise of universal adult suffrage, which granted in the U.S. didn't really finally take place until the late 60s altogether, but in the northern states by the 2nd or 3rd decade of the century was largely the case. The rise of corporations to dominate our political economy, and that was the great merger movement at the turn of the century 100 years ago pretty much set that in place. And third, the rise of public relations to protect corporate power from universal suffrage, to take the risk out of democracy, to constantly inculcate the realm of ideas with propaganda favorable to business and hostile to challenges to business like labor unions or government regulation.
To take the risk out of democracy, and you feel we can put that risk back?
We have to, or otherwise it's not democracy. I mean, that's the whole struggle we have to engage in. I mean, there still is a lot of freedom in this country. We still have, I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yes, but why do you combine those things, democracy, freedom? Those things historically have not necessarily gone together. In fact, freedom has been frequently threatened by democracy.
In what sense?
By the rule of the people.
Like when?
Like when, in terms of, shall we go back to the French Revolution as the best possible example, or the Russian Revolution?
Sure. Well, but was that a democracy? I mean, did you have formal elections? I mean, did you have a rule of law? I mean, but that might be getting us off track. But I mean, okay, yeah, they're different.
You're not talking about the rule of law. You're talking about the will of the people.
Well, okay, they're two different things. There's liberal rights, and then there's democracy, the rule of the many, and they aren't identical. They're closely related. I'd argue, and I think you can't have the two, can't have one without the other. It's hard to imagine having liberal rights without having a democracy, ultimately, if the liberal rights are going to mean something for the entirety of the population. Unless you're looking at liberal rights and freedom strictly in commercial terms, which is how they've been defined today. They've been sort of transposed from meaning rights of human development to expand your mind, your intellect, and your soul, to expanding your bank account.
Liberal isn't a very much of a good word in your book, is it?
Well, not in the sense as it's used today. It's this new version, what's called neoliberalism, which has no interest in the soul or the human development, but is simply interested in protecting the powers of those who want to make money from any sort of control, the powers of the wealthy few to do whatever they please.
You know, as a liberal, I don't accept that definition, but then that gives me the last word because our time is up. But Rich Media, Poor Democracy, I think, is a quite extraordinary book. Robert McChesney, thank you for coming again today to discuss it.
My pleasure.
And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the M. Weiner Foundation of New Jersey, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the William T. Grant Foundation, and from the corporate community, Rhoda Finn.